Welcome, everyone. My name is Emanuel Kulczycki. I'm the head of the Scholarly Communication Research Group. And today, during our seminar on science and semi-peripheries, we have a great pleasure and honor to see and hear Leandro Rodriguez Medina. Leandro will provide us a talk. After this talk, I will have a pleasure to provide you a short co-presentation. Our seminar will be led by Jakub. Jakub, please.
That's me. Hello, everyone.
Yourself. And after our two presentations, we will open the floor for the discussion, because the idea standing behind the seminar is not only to hear great talks and presentation, but to discuss, because we believe that all of us share some common interests. So now I will give the floor for Jakub, and Jakub will introduce our speaker. Jakub?
Of course. My name is Jakub Krzewski. I'm a member of Scholarly Communication Research Group, and this is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the third seminar in our series on science and semi-peripheries. This very day, we have a very special guest. Here with us is Professor Leandro Rodriguez Medina, someone really important from my research perspective. A few years ago, I was reflecting on a topic of center and peripheries together with my colleague from our research group, and this is when we encountered Professor Medina's work, and I here mean centers and peripheries knowledge productions. And since he was an important point of reference for many people in our research group, so it's really good to have you here and finally meet you in person. Professor Medina is an associate professor. He's based in the Department of International Relations and Political Science at the Universidad de las Americas Pueblas in Mexico. He is also a member of the National System of Research of the Mexican Council for Science and Technology, and the founding editor-in-chief of Tapuya, Latin American Science, Technology and Society. Professor Medina is our guest, but also we have this tradition that a person from our research group provides a commentary to the main topic, and here in this role is Emanuel. Emanuel is, as already he introduced himself as a head of our research group. So he will present a brief commentary also on the topic. Emanuel is social scientist, social scholar who is investigating evaluation systems, evaluation of science, evaluation of research. He's currently working on his book about evaluation game. So how scientists, how researchers try to adapt to the rules imposed by the evaluation systems in different national contexts. So without further ado, I would like to give voice to Professor Medina. Please start your presentations. You have about 30 minutes, after which we will move on to Emanuel's commentary. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. It's a pleasure. And for me, it's like being at home, because my brother's name is Emanuel. So probably talking with Emanuel has been part of my life for most of these 43 years. I'm very, very happy to be here. I would like to share the screen in order to start the presentation. Can you see the presentation now? Yeah. Okay, great. So I will try to summarize some recent findings of the social sciences in Latin America, because probably for some of you it could be a context with which you are not familiar. And then I would like to focus on some development that I have been doing on how to conceptualize the connection between centers and peripheries from my first research as a PhD student at Cambridge University. So let me show if it works. Okay, let's talk first about what's the problem. why we can say we have a problem here, because maybe there is no problem, you know, just to be in the periphery is to be nice. I used to say that if I live in a peripheral country like Sweden or New Zealand, I'm okay. I don't mind to be in the periphery. And of course, there are some central countries which I also have some serious differences. So let me mention, I will reduce the image. Okay, here. This is a cloud of keywords of research produced in Latin America according or using Scopus database from 2000 to 2020. So the last 20 years of social science production, mainly focused on political science and sociology. So I think that this is just a kind of map, you know, what I'm introducing here. I want to mention a couple of things. One is probably the central role of the expression Latin America, which clearly speaks of the need of social scientists to contextualize their research when they publish in what we can call mainstream journals. Here, probably you know this, but in many central institutions and central countries, you don't need to contextualize your research. You just do research on gender, on work, on democracy, without any kind of reference to a particular place, particular country. But for the periphery, we need to do that, especially if you want to publish in mainstream journals. So the first thing to mention here is this. I don't know if you can see the arrow here, but Latin America is an important keyword among the thousands of publications I'm dealing with here. The second one, and probably a little bit bigger, is democracy. And democracy has been a very important problem for the last 4 years in the region, probably from the 80s on, and especially in the 80s. Latin America and some part of Europe, and then Eastern Europe in particular, democracy was the topic of the social science. So the same happens here. The other thing I would like to do here is to break this into several clusters, which is a tool that can be used to deal with this kind of information. So first of all, we have this cluster one around democracy and institutions, transparency, constitutionalism, political parties, institutional design, and so on. So we have a group of papers referring to these topics, which is probably the biggest and most important cluster. Then we have a second cluster that I would like you to pay attention to, because probably and sadly, this is one of the most important topics in Latin America in the last, I would say, 10 years. And if you focus on particular countries like Colombia in the 1990s and the first decade of this century, and now Mexico since the last 10 years probably, violence and related topics like fear, police, organized crime, paramilitarism are very important topics, and they constitute a second cluster. Then we have a growing cluster on gender, again, violence, care, feminism, attitude, and also mass media, because it was the connection between the representation of women in mass media has been one of the most important topics. So we have another cluster here around the gender aspect. Then we have something that in particular in Argentina has been called memory, truth, and justice. It's a group of topics related to the past during the dictatorship. Even in countries where there was no dictatorship, like Mexico, for example, there was some sort of dirty war for several years in the past century, and now after the war against the cartels, the drug cartels, again we have these problems of memory, truth, and justice, and is connected with people who disappear, and mostly by states and states armed forces. Then we have another cluster around labor issues. We have there care again, work, labor market, inequality management. Then we have inequality and development, which is considered one of the most important clusters in Latin America because of the connection with one of the most relevant theoretical frameworks emerging from the region, which is dependency theory, which was connected with inequality, but particularly with development. And we still have, I won't present information about this today, but if you change from papers in journals to books indexed by Scopus, development is clearly connected now with sustainable development, but is the topic of the region. Then we have regional integration, which is more economic analysis, economic growth, regional integration, Mercosur, which is one of the blocks in the region. Then we have education and pedagogy, which is very strong because the Scopus database has, within Latin America, has a bias towards Brazil. And in Brazil, the whole pedagogy of the oppressed, coming from Paulo Freire's philosophy of education, is very, very powerful and has transcended to other Latin American countries. But it's the weight of Brazil in particular which explains this particular cluster. And then we have the kind of usual problem with databases, which is a very weird cluster, according to my first-hand experience in Latin America, which is phenomenology. It's okay. The reason, again, is Brazil, and Brazil has a strong tradition of doing this research, but particularly for a reason that we can talk later, it has also to do with the journals that were finally indexed by Scopus, and that creates some unbalances. Also, to know a little bit about Latin America, we can review the topic of collaborations. This is a map in which collaborations are counted between different regions in the world, and which is clearly visible here and problematic, is that Latin American collaboration is basically with Western Europe and North America. There is no South-South collaboration, a strong South-South collaboration. Of course, there are some cases, but strong South-South collaboration between Latin America and other regions of the world. So this is not necessarily the cases in other countries. If you see other peripheral regions like Southeast Asia, for example, and even Africa, you have more connection with other parts of the world, even with other southern parts of the world. This is just for you to know exactly the amount of data I'm dealing with here. The Latin American production in Scopus in social sciences, focusing on sociology and political science, is this big, in terms of products, in terms of citations. So, for example, Brazil has more than 7 million papers published in this period, 20 years. And got 23 million citations. And then Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. So it's a very concentrated system if you take Latin America as a region, because 5 countries, only Brazil account for almost 42% of production and 33% of citation. So it's a highly concentrated system. If you take Latin America as a whole, which is a problematic category, and we were talking a little bit about that before. But one of the things that someone asked me in this presentation here in Paris was, well, but where do Latin American sociologists publish? So from the first presentation to the second presentation, I went for this information. And this is something that for me is clearly connected with the structure of centers and periphery, but at the same time, to some extent, illuminating here. If we pay attention to where they publish, we have most of them in these 25 journals listed here on the right, journals from Latin America. Top 10 by sure, they are all from Latin American journals. So the interesting thing is that when you pay attention to the only 2 non-Latin American journals in this list and move to the impact in terms of citations, you see that World Development, a journal where many Latin American social scientists publish, is the most cited journal for Latin America. And then you have Latin American Perspective, another journal from the north, as the 3rd journal in terms of citation. So this shows a clear problem, which is more clear, I think, or clearer, I would say, in this slide. If you go and ask for the most cited works by Latin America, regardless whether journals are from the north or the south, you have, for this period, 200, we had to reduce here because of the amount of information from 2010 to 2019. We have a paper that get almost 1,500 citations, and the most cited in Administrative Science Quarterly. And then we have a list of journals in that 4th column that you can see, all of them from the north. So to have an impact, research results must be published in US or European journal. That's for sure, and this is clearly from here. There is no Latin American journal among the top 100 journals with the most cited Latin American articles. If we understand Latin American article as an article that has at least 1 Latin American author. You should go to the number 114 in order to find Revista de Economía Política, which is a Brazilian journal. Yeah? So there you have the first Latin American journal. If you go to Web of Science, which is considered the most prestigious database in the academic world, well, we have a big problem here. I mean, with social scientists, sociologists in particular, out of 150 sociology journal index in Web of Science, there are only 2 Latin American journals, ranking 144 and 146. Yeah, these are the only 2 journals. So what's my message here, and something that is important, and probably Emanuel will deal with this as an evaluation, that you cannot at the same time publish in some databases and publish in Latin American journals. If you have to make a decision as a Latin American social scientist, it's not only about impact, it's about what kind of journals are indexed. So if you are asked by your university or the National Council to publish in indexed or web, or particularly some indexes like Web of Science and Scopus, then you have a problem there. Then you have a problem to meet both criteria, to publish in a Latin American journal and to publish in an indexed journal. You have to choose. So the problem, if we go in a more comparative way to see Latin America in relation to mainstream social science, but also in relation to other peripheries, what we find is that Latin America has a marginal production in social sciences. Although you can see an increase almost in every region of the world of the social sciences production from the 1980s until almost today, although it's not data, more recent data. If you pay attention to database, we have this bias that create the problem that I just shown. You know, only 2.8% of journals indexed in this case, let me check because I don't want to miss here, is Web of Science, sorry, Scopus, are Latin American journals. So it's absolutely marginal against 87, 88% of journals in the North. But the interesting thing here, again, connected with evaluation to some extent, is that you can say, okay, but I need some kind of database to assess the production of social scientists. Yes, probably you do need some sort of infrastructure. But the question is why you choose Scopus or Web of Science, where the presence of Latin American journal is marginal, 2.9, 2.2%. When you have things like Latindex or Redalic, which are databases in which between 79 and almost 85% of journals indexed are from Latin America. And even Latin American institutions, universities, research centers, national councils prefer journals indexed by Web of Science and Scopus. So for me, this information is very important because it points to this. It's not true that we don't have infrastructure to show where our research is published. What we don't have is a public policy that recognizes this infrastructure as good enough, I would say, to be taken into account. And this is very clear if you go from Web of Science to Scopus to Cielo, another database now part of Web of Science. You can see there how many papers were indexed in a particular period here by these different databases. So if you take Social Science Citation Index, you have 3,700 papers, and if you take Cielo, you have 31,000 papers. So it's absolutely problematic to choose the big database to consider where is the production of Latin America. So I will go now to what I call some answers in order to understand this, what is related to my work in the last years. So first of all, I started to study academics with a focus on Argentinian political scientists, because this is where I come from. This is the field that I know the most, and this is the field that I wanted to understand, because my concern, even as a student, as undergrad student, was always the same. Why are we reading Habermas to understand our public opinion in Argentina when it doesn't work like that? Or why are we reading Robert Dahl's theory of democracy when you see that democracy in Argentina doesn't work like Dahl's democracy? So why we are doing that? I was interested in that since my time as a student. So I returned to Argentina to do field work. And probably what is more interesting from my first research is that peripheral academics use Northern knowledge, Northern scholarship to organize not only what they read, their entirely careers are organized by Northern knowledge, or knowledge coming from the North. And that is partially because of the lack of symbolic and material resources that you need in order to engage in meaningful exchanges with those centers. I won't go into this in detail now. We can talk about this later. The other thing, and that's why probably the book is not just a critique of centers and peripheries, because it says something about the periphery, which is it's the most rational thing to do to reinforce the asymmetrical character of global knowledge production structure by relying on knowledge from the North. I mean, if you have to organize a seminar on democracy, it's probably that you will read get more easily text from Dahl or from any other Sartori or any other Western European or American political scientist, that from political scientist who writes probably 200 kilometers from your office. So there is a whole problem there, because when I say that this is the most rational things to do, is that there are very important incentives to reproduce the structure of centers and peripheries. The reason to accept knowledge from the North, so it's not necessarily, and that's another thing that I think is important from what I found. The reason to accept knowledge from the North is not necessarily rooted in its inherent value. It's not necessarily better. In fact, it's not always really appropriated here. It's more about the opportunities, the things you can do with the knowledge that you appropriate. And this is a kind of pragmatic approach. When I say the things you can do is exactly that. Theories are not just read, are not just interpreted. It's not just a textual thing. You can do a lot of things, and I try to describe those in my first book. But the problem here was that I didn't focus on any particular theory, because I wanted to kind of understand a field. So in the second project, I zoom in into one particular theory, which is Niklas Luhmann's system theory, in order to see precisely how that appropriation or reception happened. And I needed to focus on one particular theory because I knew that the kind of reception that the kind of work you have to do in order to create the conditions for a theory to be applied, of course, it has to do with the content of the theory. So for me, during my first research, it was impossible to deal with all the theories that were received by a peripheral field like Argentinian political science. In this case, I focus on two countries, Spanish-speaking countries, Mexico and Chile, because those were the countries where Niklas Luhmann's work were translated and more powerful in terms of what happened after translation and after starting to use Niklas Luhmann theory. So what I found is that peripheral scholars developed a type of boundary work to create a space for the arriving knowledge. They do need to create the niche that will be filled with the knowledge that is coming. And that has, of course, to do with the content of the knowledge. Just as an anecdote, Niklas Luhmann's arrival into Chile is in the middle of the Pinochet dictatorship. So the whole boundary work involved in reception has to do with being system theory and neutral and scientific theory, not the kind of theory committed with social change, for example, like Marxist social theory. So that kind of boundary work for me was interesting. In particular, in this case, I talk about different types of boundary work. The other thing, and that continued my research in a way, was that peripheral scholars benefited from the structuring effect of the knowledge coming from the North in the form of what I call subordinating objects. So when you take the theory from the North, because they have the opportunity to shape the field to some extent, not completely, but they have the opportunity to shape the field, that benefited the actors that appropriated these theories. And finally, the peripheral scholars received the theory while transforming the theory through a series of reconnections. And this is a process that might take decades. In this book, I talk about generations of scholars involved in the reception of Niklas Luhmann. So in the last 5 years, I consider that from the many aspects of the central and periphery structure, probably one of the most interesting and politically relevant aspect is research assessment, in which Emanuel is working. For me, the most interesting was circulation of knowledge. I'm interested in how knowledge circulates, how it moves. So knowledge circulation is not a natural phenomenon, although knowledge is usually produced to circulate. It's produced to be universal to some extent. So circulation is somehow in the heart of any piece of idea that we can call knowledge. But yet, knowledge doesn't circulate freely and without any constraint and in all directions at the same time. So in this case, I take centers and periphery not as fixed entities, but they do develop stable or more or less stable patterns of interactions. And that is regardless which countries or institutions are taken to be part of centers and periphery. I mean, countries that were central in the 16th century or 17th century are not central now. Languages that were central are not central now. Institutions that perhaps were central are not central now, and so on. And many will arrive. You see, if you pay attention to rankings, university rankings, you see Chinese universities getting higher and higher. So what I'm doing in the last years is try to understand circulation, but circulation in the context of asymmetries of knowledge production. So I have published some works in which I'm trying to introduce some theoretical concepts and paying attention to specific aspects of knowledge circulation, like, for example, the personal bonds between academics, what we call with some colleagues asymmetrical cooperation, which is a cooperation under the assumption that the asymmetry is there, and how to organize cooperation between entities that are not equal. Also reflecting on English and the kind of middle ground that is usually necessary to deal with global English and global communication. Also open access, because it's usually presented as the solution to circulation. You know, everything is open and that's it. And history shows that although it's open, it doesn't circulate evenly worldwide. So in this context, and this is the final part of my presentation, in this context, I'm focused on one particular pattern, which I consider to be resistant, persistent, stable, and very powerful during many, many years in global knowledge circulation, that has been centering and centralizing. By centering, I mean the emergent consolidation and diffusion of a naturalized idea that whatever is produced in the centers should be taken as universal, and consequently can be imposed on or over any other peripheral place. So that's centering. Centering has taken place because knowledge has been previously centralized. Centralizing refers to the creation, development, and implementation of infrastructure that allow for some places to become central nodes in global assemblages, what Bruno Latour calls centers of calculation. So because some places are able to gather information and to gather and to create the infrastructure to process the material coming from different parts of the world, they become centers of calculation, centers of knowledge production, whatever we want to call. But these two processes are different. One is about creating the infrastructure, that's centralizing, and is clearly connected to empires, if you take a historic perspective. And then you have centering. Centering has to do with the thinking perspective, with the way that once we have all the info, you believe you have all the information from all over the world, you can create a kind of idealized perspective, which is the perspective of the centers. So in this context, which for me is a very basic and simple and simplified understanding of centers and peripheries, I'm starting a project on the most difficult counter-hegemonic, unstable and ethically powerful pattern of global knowledge circulation that is decentering and decentralizing. So first, Decentering is a word that you can find everywhere, especially in humanity. Decentering the body, decentering the center. I have a book here. Let me. Oh, you are. I was about to show you a book, but I will do it later. Decentering the center. Decentering is everywhere. It's in philosophy, in political science, in sociology, especially in sociology of knowledge, but also in sociology of gender, of course, and so on. So decentering is crucial. It requires to avoid considering some actors or idea, values, technologies, way of thinking as central, and also as parameters from which everything around should be evaluated. This process of decentering prevents one actor from performing as spokesperson for the others without having been so delegated. So thereby, decentering challenges the monopoly on representation that some actors get, while implying the development of central actors to think from the edge. So decentering, again, I want to emphasize this. You find decentering everywhere. What you don't find is decentralizing. This is for me, it's a missing part. Sorry, I will do that. It's a missing part. So decentralizing requires incorporating into the assemblages, because these assemblages that were part of empires or are part of the global network of science and technology, you know, they are global assemblages. So we have a global science, actually. What we have also is an asymmetric global science. So decentralization requires incorporating into the assemblages with equal decision-making powers actors that have been marginalized, ignored, underestimated, or eliminated. Decentralizing from the northern perspective requires delegation to the actors on the periphery in as many epistemic processes as possible. It recognizes the permanent situational limitations of both, I mean, marginalized people, but also those in the center that are thinking in a decentering way, but they are in the center. So I'm interested in epistemic authority now. Epistemic authority has been concentrated for centuries in some places or some groups. That's the history of empires again. And the idea is how to move epistemic authority to the margins, how to be delegated, shared, successfully challenged, or reconfigured. At the same time, given that decentralization doesn't take actors at the margin to be passive appropriators of this authority, analysis of decentralizing forces us to think about the actions, strategies, possibilities, and limitations that from the periphery have been articulated in order to acquire full epistemic authority. So I'm trying to see successful and unsuccessful cases in which epistemic authorities were delegated, were moved from centers to periphery, and see what happened. And it's part of a larger project of decentralization. For why is epistemic authority is important here? And what? Because there is, I would say, a part of literature that think that epistemic authority is something that every human being has, and it's just a kind of human right aspect, because you can say that every person in the world has the possibility to be a knowing subject, an epistemic subject. But actually, for me, this is not exactly the point. Of course, everyone may be a knower. All people can know, but that's not epistemic authority in the perspective I have. So for people in the margin to get epistemic authority, material and symbolic processes that ultimately aim to rebalance asymmetrical epistemic power relations must be created, stabilized, and extend it. So we don't have this structure. Every time we create transnational or international structure, we ended up with elite, usually from the north, that co-opt those infrastructures to reproduce, maybe without intention to do that, to reproduce the centralization. So we may have a kind of decenter thinking that is actually centralized. So the consequence of this is that epistemic decentralization seeks to complexify heterogeneous assemblages through their expansion, densification, and re-articulation. Especially, we want to make a more dense network in the margins. That means, in more geopolitical terms, more south-south connections, and the structure to keep those connections in time and space. In short, decentralization will be rise to broader, more interconnected networks, especially at the margins, in which power could be redistributed. So actually, if this happens, we are talking about the redistribution of agency. When you successfully move epistemic authority, you actually are also moving the possibility of more agency in the networks. And I will stop here, probably took more time than expected. Sorry for that.
It's okay, it's okay. We are still in the timely, so thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. And I would like to give voice to Emanuel, who will briefly comment on the presentation. And then I will give back the voice to Professor Medina to have a chance to answer to the commentary. Thank you. Emanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kuba. I will share my presentation with you. Leandro, thank you for a very inspiring presentation. And it was great to see not only numbers about Latin America, which are very interesting because for European scholars, situation in Latin America is quite different, but also your theoretical contribution to understand the situation. In my short presentation, I would like to show that the situation in Latin America is very similar to the situation in Europe when we don't think about Europe as Germany, UK, and France. There are other countries and we share very similar issues. And I would like to focus on one of aspects which you mentioned, that is infrastructures, which does not allow us as social scientists to provide the proper image of our production. And I would like to focus on multilingualism. In this case, the situation in Europe is quite different than in Latin America. In Latin America, there is lingua franca, which is not English, but Spanish. In Poland, in Czech Republic, in Norway, in Sweden, we produce papers in our local languages. So I would like to focus on multilingualism from a perspective of scholarly communication and show that multilingualism should not be understood as internationalization. That is, scholars are not multilingual when they publish in English only and when we focus on papers only. So, sorry. When I will talk about multilingualism, I refer to writing and publishing in more than language. So, for example, in Polish and English, in Polish and German, in German and French, and having publications in more than one language. Because when we use data on publications and languages, we often don't know whether a researcher published and wrote the paper himself or herself, but maybe there was a substantial help of translator or some editor. So At the very beginning, I would like to ask also a very simple question. What do we know about publication patterns in social sciences and humanities in Europe? I added humanities because sometimes it's extremely difficult to say why, for example, education sciences are defined as humanities in one European countries and social sciences in another. The same issue with, for example, law or economic. So what is this? What kind of picture you can see? The right bottom corner is visible, but actually we see nothing, or we see publications of Polish scholars from social sciences and humanities according to Web of Science. 15% of the total output from 1 year is visible on this picture, but we still don't see the actual picture. But of course, we can say that there are more international countries which have a lot of publications in English, but actually Danish publications, according to Web of Science, are covered only in 50%. When we take Danish publications from the national current research information system, we see a bigger picture. Of course, the international indexes will say us that they cover core parts of the whole scientific productions. The two most important sociological journals from Latin America. It's enough. Reading those journals, you will say, you will know everything. But actually, we should know the whole picture, because sometimes we are social scientists and humanities scholars. We publish a lot of important and impactful papers in journals, in books. As Leandro said, one of the clusters was visible when we looked into book chapters and monographs, not in articles, that we should know the whole pictures if we want to say something about social scientists. And now I would like to show you a short story. In the first part, I will show you the image of publishing by social scientists when we focus on publications. How many publications in English have scholars in Poland? What share of publications, and so on and so on. But with our colleagues, we started to suggest that we should not focus on papers, but on researchers, because researchers publish in many languages and papers are always in one language. And it is important that researchers publish in one language to their colleagues in discipline and in another languages to other audiences, like public audience in their countries. And to show this, we use national databases, because as you can see on this figure, this purple line represents the number of publications of social scientists and humanist researchers in 8 European countries, and a green line represents the number of publications in national databases. As you can see, those 15% for Poland and 50% for Denmark are from these studies. Actually, not so much publications we can see using Web of Science. With Scopus, the situation is quite better, but still definitely not enough. And even we use national databases, we see such a situation. Almost 80% of scholars in Belgium published in English. Almost 80% of papers published in social science and humanities is published in English. In Finland is 68%, in Norway 60%, and in Poland just 17% of papers published in SSH are in English. The overwhelming majority is published in Polish. And when policymakers see this, they always say, well, those researchers from Central and European countries are not international. They do not publish in English. Actually, those databases they use, Web of Science and Scopus, make that such a picture is actually the only picture possible to see. So this is why bibliometric is focused on publications, and this is why it is the easiest picture you can generate. Just push a few buttons and you will get a report. But actually, when you put some effort, you can move from publications to researchers and ask the questions how researchers actually publish in many languages. This is why with our colleagues from 7 countries, we have done a study on journal articles published in 3-year period. We have analyzed over 164,000 peer-reviewed articles published in over 50 languages. Those articles in those 50 languages were almost in total invisible in Web of Science and Scopus. 97% of those publications were not indexed in Web of Science and 92% were not indexed in Scopus. So this picture of journal articles is generated using national data, and when you use international data, you cannot see it. So I will show you just one slide showing the multilingualism of researchers from the same country you see before. As you remember, Norwegian and Finnish and Flemish scholars were presented as highly multilingual and internationalized because their papers were mostly in English. But when you look at the level of individual researchers, you can see that over 50% of Polish researchers in social sciences and humanities published in 3 years period articles in at least 2 languages. In Slovenia, almost 60% of researchers published articles in 2 languages and over 10% in 3 languages and more. And in another study, which I have been doing on the Polish data, but in this study I use also book chapters and monographs, I see that researchers in 4 or 5 years period publish in 3, 4, 5 different languages. So multilingualism of Polish, Slovenian, Czechish researcher is higher or similar than Danish and Flemish and Norwegian, but we have to focus on researchers, not only on papers. So we see that this practice of multilingual publishing is ongoing practice in all fields, regardless of geographical location, political situation, and historical heritage. But we have to change our focus from publications to researchers. And in countries like Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia, where it is more common to use the local language in publishing, as you can see on this map on one of these slides, still a big share of researchers publish also in English and German and French. So this is why our research calls upon change in evaluation regimes and research policy to more recognize multilingualism scholarly communications. Publications in all languages should be counted in various institutional, national, international, also procedures of evaluation. This is why 2 years ago, with colleagues from European Network for Research Evaluation in Social Sciences and Humanities, we founded Helsinki Initiative of Multilingualism Scholarly Communication. Multilingualism is perceived different in various countries. For example, Finnish policymakers want to encourage researchers from Finland to publish more in Finnish in social sciences, whereas in Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, more publications in languages different than local languages are also important. But multilingualism is vital for social sciences public audience, also in Europe. Europe is diverse, and we see that Central and Eastern European countries face quite different challenges than Western ones. And this was my short comment to Leandro's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuel. Professor Medina, if I can invite you to briefly reply to Emanuel's comment, and then we will move on to the discussion part of our seminar.
Well, the first thing that I would like to mention is that I think of evaluation policies as well as these initiatives as part of the decentralization of the social sciences, because they include the creation of infrastructure to be able to do or to be able to meet the goal, the final goal, in this case, multilingualism or publication in different languages. The other thing is something interesting. I think in the last slide of Emanuel, there was something about the confusion between publishing in English as indicator of. Also in the ISA conference some weeks ago, in one of the session, the current editor of Current Sociology, Eloisa Martin, she was talking about that, how the journal was supporting scholars whose first language is not English in order to publish there. And of course, in Current Sociology, you can publish in other languages too. And I think that one problem here is that we need more decentering work from the North. I mean, from mainstream countries and scientific communities. We need them to accept, and that should be translated into policies in different countries, that something like writing writing and publishing in different languages is something that should be included in policies in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany. I mean, it's not just us. It's not just the other side of the story, because many people, as Emanuel showed, in the periphery speak more than one language because they have to. You know, you need to be able to review a little bit of literature in English, maybe in French or German, depending on your country and your area, because otherwise you're excluded from publication in journals, in important journals. So you have to become a multilingual scholar. There is many difficulties to overcome if you don't. But on the other hand, you have a kind of defense of this lingua franca policy, especially from those countries where that lingua franca is the native language, like the UK and the US. So they need to be forced to speak more than one language. I don't care with the second one. I mean, it could be Spanish, it could be Portuguese, it could be Polish, it could be Chinese. I don't care. The fact that they would be forced to learn a second language and use a second language, that would create a strong process of decentralization. Because if you publish, I'm thinking aloud here with you, but I guess that we face similar problems. If I write a good paper, I could publish it in Spanish in a good journal, Latin American journal, or I can try to publish in English in a mainstream journal. But the interesting thing is that just a few group of people from the North, even if they are writing about Mexico or Brazil, they choose to send the paper to Mexico and Brazil. They prefer to send the paper to Latin American Perspectives, to Latin American Research Review, I mean, whatever is within their field, you know, the US understanding of Latin America. And I think that is important to encourage through policies, that they need to be reviewed by people in the periphery, and if possible, in the peripheral language. That could create a different force. So one thing we should do with this initiative probably is connect with mainstream scholars and create the kind of mirror organization, because many of them are multilingual actually, and create organizations that transcend the north-south or center-periphery division in order to show whether, for example, language, it could be other variables, but language could be used not only as an element of separation, but also as an element of encounter. And I think that that requires multilingualism, that requires policies that encourage publishing in different languages, and that probably requires, if you go even further, you require that requires changes in the primary and secondary education, probably. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge, but I still remember that when in several states in the US, where Spanish was becoming the first language in terms of people, the number of people who speak the language, the state decided to close classes and change languages because they know what that implies. They know that language is more than a tool for communication, which is something that we should, I mean, only because of that, we should encourage that. But language is a way of understanding culture, understanding societies, understanding way of thinking. And so they realize that it could be very dangerous that English becomes a second language in some states. So they close some courses in Spanish. I'm talking about California, I'm talking about Arizona. So it's very interesting that for me, as I see these problems, Emanuel's presentation points to one of the crucial dimensions of decentralizing for me, which is language and the infrastructure we need in order to transform language from a barrier to a tool. And that could imply things like this initiative, things like policies, and also things like artificial intelligence used for automated translations and other ways to deal with our language differences and try to overcome that.
All right, thank you. Thank you both of you for your presentations, for your responses. Now I would like to invite the audience, if you'd like to pose a question, brought something to our attention to discuss, now is the time. Please raise your hand via the Zoom so I can see who is interested in posing a question. Okay, Adam Kola, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that I don't know if I should be first, but the first one. But thank you very much for both presentations. So that was really interesting to me. And I completely agree with Emanuel that we, from the Polish perspective or East and Central Europe, are really in this specific semi-peripheral situation. And I'm wondering how to deal with this problem. And of course, the question of multilingualism is crucial here. But I have a few buts here. So the first one is the fact that I used to publish in German, in Czech language, and in Russian, not only in Polish. But the question always is that at one point we will be evaluated, whether we are applying for grant or sending some papers or trying to make a career in the academia. And then whether if we are publishing something in Czech or Russian language, it is not so important in this evaluation process as it is in the when we are publishing in international publishing houses or journals in English. So this is the practical question, whether this multilingualism matters. I understand all those ethical issues, but well, I'm trying to figure out whether there are practical reasons to do so. This is my first questions to Emanuel, or maybe both of you. And the second, I try to be short as it is possible. I have good example from the US as well. This is International Comparative Literature Association, which started like 25 or 30 years ago to change the mode of doing science or scholarship within this group. It used to be comparative literature, the field which was combination of Anglophone and Francophone, sometimes German speaking world. That was all. And 25 years ago, they started to open to the really global scale. And right now it is the field where you need to know at least one non-European language, where you need to know peripheral languages, and where all conferences are, of course, still basically in English, but you can more and more use other languages. So there is one exception, I would say, in this institutional picture, but it is limited in the scale, and comparative literature, always when there is some institution in the American university, it is the first department that will be closed. And during the last crisis, we managed with this process of closing comparative literature departments, whereas English studies were still stable and in a good position. So again, the idea is really good, but I'm asking about the practice, okay? How to do something in this real world. So there are two comments and questions from me for the beginning. Thank you very much.
So if I understand, the first question was, firstly, to me, multilingual publications. In short, they doesn't matter yet in the majority of evaluation regimes. However, in some, for example, grant proposals evaluation, if you apply for a grant and would like to investigate some social issues in Mexico, you have to know Spanish. And then publications showing your experience will be important. But as Leandro said, it's rather a political agenda yet. And we should do something and push the governments, but also researchers, to use more languages, because I fully agree that and in our group, during our breakfast and lunches, we often discuss this issue of multilingualism, and one of solution is to push other researchers, especially from US and UK, to speak other language. But Leandro will say definitely something, can say something more about this.
You know, I chair the 2014 Social Study of Science conference. Social Study of Science is a society that was founded by Robert Merton, the sociologist Robert Merton, in the 70s, and it became the most important society for STS, along with the European Association of Science and Technology. And the first time they went for a conference to the Global South was to Buenos Aires in 2014. And one of the first things we said is that that would be the first trilingual conference ever. Because we were, actually there were two associations doing a joint meeting, the Latin American Association of Social Study of Science and the Society for Social Study of Science. And so the conference was trilingual. You could go and make your presentation in your language. And at the moment of asking questions, we ask people to serve as translator if necessary, otherwise speak in their languages. And of course, it created some problems. So after a month or two after the conference, the survey that we sent right after the conference was analyzed, and we were very, very, worried about the outcome of that. And most people were very happy with the experience, although they recognize that they miss things because they don't speak Portuguese or Spanish or English. So I think that that's the kind of I wouldn't say it's a middle ground, but that's the kind of frictions that we should encourage to happen. It's gonna be frictional. It's not gonna be smooth. It's gonna, I mean, it's difficult because someone has to lose something, even if that something is comfort, because they are used to go to a conference and understand everything, and other people making the effort to translate their PowerPoint presentations and so on. So they had to accept that. That was a negotiation. And I think that worked, although the final product is not a perfect conference in which everyone understood everything. That didn't happen. And probably that won't happen for a long time, if ever. So that's my first thing. I think we should, I mean, if I have to reply to Adam, is I don't have any general rule here. I have, probably because of my training in STS, is everything is a case. So it's case by case. Maybe a conference is a good case to taste multilingualism. A journal, I'm the editor-in-chief of Tapuya, and if you go to Tapuya and use the HTML version of the every paper, Taylor and Francis, our publisher, which is one of the bad guys of the story, I can return to that later. Taylor and Francis has a system. So if you highlight a paragraph, you click the right button of the mouse, and you can listen the paragraph. If you can't read it, you can listen it. You can get a dictionary, or you can translate into like 11 different languages. So I try from English into Spanish, which is my mother tongue. And I have to say that it kind of worked. I mean, probably you lose something. Again, it's frictional. It's a frictional translation. It's not a perfect translation if something like a perfect translation ever happens. But it works. So what I'm trying to do now is to use the system in order to get the reviewers to review the paper in their language, regardless the language of submission. So you can submit in Polish, and the reader can read it in English and write the review in English and send you the review in English and translate the review into Polish again, if necessary, because maybe you can do it in English. So that's the crazy world I think we will live in the very near future. In the very near future, you know, I will step aside next year as editor-in-chief after 5 years. And when the first time I talk about this kind of automatic translation, like 4 years ago, that was kind of, well, you know, in the future. And it's kind of happening. So maybe I'm over optimistic here, and I shouldn't be, because that's not a very, very good attitude in the academic world. But I think the most important aspect of this is the frictional nature of any project, and on the other hand, the unfinished, incomplete, uncomfort situation in which we are when we are doing that. Meanwhile, we can push people to try speaking or understanding, or at least staying in the room, even if they don't understand a word, because they speak only English. So stay there, don't leave there, just soften your ear a little bit to other languages, to other grammar, and try to change our own policies. Because what really freaks me out is that we as scholars are the one, through the national systems of researchers, for example, in Mexico, to the national councils, which actually create the constraints that actually are a problem for us. So the fact that in my country, some colleagues don't take publication in Spanish as serious publications, is not a problem of the US or the UK. It's a problem of the Mexican Council for Science and Technology. And that's really, for me, the kind of first step in the chain of changes that we need.
Okay, thank you. Now, I would like to gather a few voices from the audience to maybe give more opportunity for our audience to engage with our guests. So I can see that Kamil Łuczaj has a question, and also Marta Scholl. So if I could ask you to pose your questions now, maybe Marta first, and then Kamil, and then we will move to our guest to reply.
I want to start out by thanking the organizers of this. This is the first time since I moved back to Poland from the US. I straddle two worlds. My one leg is in Minnesota in the US, my one leg is in Krakow. It's the first time in the 7 years that I've been in Poland that this sort of academic exchange has taken place. So I commend you for the choice of guest. It was truly an inspiring presentation. And I commend you for practicing what you're preaching in the very format of the seminar. It's very nice to listen to all of you. And I saw Professor Czarniawska, Barbara Czarniawska was here earlier, and I regret she left, because as I was listening to these two presentations, I was reminded of something she said a long time ago as an observation about the academic study of organizations. She noted that we have lost our interest in rationality understood as the alignment of ends and means, that we are all about instrumental rationality. How do we align what we want with the instruments we use, but we've lost track of the values that are at the top of the ladder. So we sort of put our ladder against a wall, climb all the way to the top, and it's only then that we realize, oh, is this the wall we've been wanting to climb up against, right? And I think in the context, Leandro, of the ecological crisis, which you mentioned, we are finding our way to the top of a ladder, realizing maybe this is contributing to the extinction of our species, and we as academics are not without fault. But I guess the question I'd want to pose to both of you is, we've talked about decentralization, we've talked about multilingualism, and I would want to ask you for what ends? Right? What's at the top of that ladder for you? Alejandro, is it so that we feel better at conferences when our language is spoken, right? Or Emanuel, is it multiple languages so that we feel there's greater fairness in how we're treated, or do you see greater ends, right, than that? I'd want to ask you about the ends for which you believe to be important.
Okay, so before you answer, I will also ask Kamil to pose his question, and then we will move to your replies.
Okay, so thank you for both presentations, but I've got just one brief question for Leandro, because as far as I remember, you don't use much the category of semi-periphery in your book. You refer to peripheries or global centers. Why is it so? Do you think this category is useless, or there's another explanation for that? And if you think that we should apply this category, what's the difference between semi-periphery and periphery of knowledge production, according to your understanding? Thank you.
Okay, so back to our speakers.
So if I may, I will shortly reply, because two questions are addressed to Leandro. And Marta asked about the ends of multilingualism. For me, there are two key aims of showing that multilingualism is important and why it is important. Firstly, because in various languages we communicate with various audiences, and I do believe that researchers in social sciences in Poland sometimes should publish in Polish, not in English. When I publish papers about Polish higher education system and research evaluation system, some papers should be published in Polish, maybe some paper further in English. If our system based on audit culture, of evaluation regimes, of publishing only in mainstream journals make that it is not practical for young researchers to publish in their local languages, it will diminish science and communicating research results finally. And the other thing is that I do believe that some researchers, by publishing in English, they avoid the actual critique of their work. As Leandro said about North American scholars who publish about Mexico without publishing in Mexico, it's easy. I can publish about Slovakia in Poland, or about France in Poland in Polish, or in Polish journals, or in US journals. It's easier than going to the actual audience and the actual speakers. So I would say that if multilingualism of our publications will be properly reflected in higher education and science system, we will have to better communicate with the actual audience and the proper audience, and we better assess, but in the terms of peer review, the results.
Thank you. I think I will start from there probably, because that's exactly something that we decided to do in Tapuya. When we receive an article in Tapuya, we send we use blind peer review. We send the article to one Latin American scholar and to one scholar from other parts of the world. And that's a policy for the journal. And that's a policy for the journal because we think that through peer review, different traditions of literature, different ways of approaching the problem are put together. And the author has to decide whether it's useful or not, and reply and do the job that reviewers explicitly or implicitly are asking. So I think that any sort of multilingualism, either as infrastructure, as a policy, as a personal decision, or as institutional policy like in Tapuya, I think that helps to create the kind of bridges that some of us are interested in. The other part of the question is probably more difficult. I'm working on a book on decentralization of knowledge with Sandra Harding and other people. I think that for me, I don't know, this probably has to do with my background, even my class background, middle class from a peripheral country. For me, if we are able to decentralize epistemic authority, that's a higher recognition that you can make to someone else. That person is able to produce knowledge, to understand and produce knowledge. That has to do with education, actually, at the end of the day. And for me, if I have to talk about the end is a world in which talking to other people, ideally in different languages, but talking to other people is actually recognizing their epistemic status. I think we should do whatever it takes to create the conditions for that to happen. And interestingly, the conditions are in both directions. You know, some things have to be done in the centers, and some things have to be done in the peripheries. Because in that sense, for me, that is a middle ground. There are more things to do in our countries, in our societies, in our scientific communities, but other things have to change in the north. So, for example, again, I'm pretty sure that my understanding of this has to do with Tapuya and with the project in which I've been involved. In Tapuya, we get funds from the north, from a private donor and UCLA, with no condition. And the editorial office should be in Latin America, and the decisions should be made in Latin America. And for me, that's a kind of weird thing, because if I'm as an Argentinian, I would never be part of a project in which they give you the money and they put no conditions to that. It makes no sense. In Argentina, it makes no sense. They will say first the conditions, and then if you accept the condition, they will say, okay, I will give you $2. But not the other way around for several $1,000s. So for me, that's a transforming experience, because it's a way actually of empowering actors. So if you want to empower actor, you have to create a condition for that actor to talk to you, the Dean of the Graduate School for Education and Information Study at UCLA, as equals. Although we are not equal, I know that. And I have to play with the rules that we are somehow equal, somehow not equal. So I like to think of this project within the concept of intersectionality, the kind of connection between different forms of vulnerability that allows for articulations. But my final end is ideally a world in which we are all respected as epistemic subjects. And that's connected probably with the way that Boaventura de Sousa Santos also talk about epistemicide. I think that we are living in a world in which forms of knowledges are disappearing, and for me, that's what we should preserve in order to start to build, I don't know, cosmopolitics or whatever we want to call it, but we have to preserve the right and the conditions of production of knowledge. So that's my answer. Probably it's too vague. I'm sorry, but we can keep on talking because I love very much the way you frame the question. And finally, about the word of why I don't use semi-periphery. Well, I think it's a very weird reason. I'm concerned with asymmetries of knowledge. So there are asymmetries between the periphery and the semi-periphery, and then between the semi-periphery and the centers. And so I am not very much interested in a kind of in identifying what is a specific of centers and a specific of semi-peripheries and a specific of periphery. I'm interested in how once you have unbalanced power positions, that create a very particular scenario for circulation of knowledge. So that's why I probably didn't use semi-periphery as a concept, because I didn't need the concept at that point. If I can find that the semi-periphery is a kind of middle ground, probably that would be also a reply to Marta. That would be the middle ground in a way. But I'm not sure that this is so far the way that I would like to frame my own understanding of knowledge circulation.
Okay, we have one more question from Brett, but before I will give you the voice, I would like to ask all other participants if there are any other questions. Now is the time to also raise your hand if you would like to add something.
Yeah, should I ask?
Yeah, Brett, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the talks, Emanuel and Leandro. My question is the amount of resources that you think should be spent on achieving these goals. So Leandro, you said at one point even like we should change our primary school education to, I think first in general, there's a question of, do you want a lingua franca? Do we want a situation where everybody kind of understands each other, a lingua franca? Or do we want a situation where everybody can kind of speak their own language, maybe one or two languages, maybe three languages even, but then it becomes a problem of not everybody can speak with everybody. And I think it becomes a problem of how much time are we spending on learning all of these languages? And I also wanted to ask if you want to increase the language that is spent, I could imagine, for instance, partially the reason why the North maybe is, or at least the UK and the US are knowledge producing centers, is because they are not spending so much time learning other languages, right? So if I spend 10% of my time or 20% of my time learning English rather than learning science or learning, something like that, I can imagine, one factor, you know what I mean? And so what is the trade-off? I definitely do agree, Manuel. You said that if you are creating knowledge for local populations, such as, if I'm creating something specifically about Polish schools, then probably it should be in Polish or in a language that my intended audience can understand. And I think that there's an argument there. But yeah, especially if we were talking about global knowledge, or is there such a thing as global knowledge? My suggestion might be then that as many people as possible should be able to understand it, and I wouldn't want to put my global knowledge in a way that only 20%, that I knew only 20% of the world understands. That, you know what I mean? It would be better, in my opinion, if 80% of the people could understand it. It just makes, to me, sense. But yeah, so how much resources should we be spending toward achieving these goals? And what are the trade-offs? I do think there's an argument that people, are not learning as many other languages, a trade-off. Anyways, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I also see one more question from Myra. So please, if you'd like to join our conversation.
Okay, more than a question. Well, the questions will come in a second. I just want to make a comment. And this goes to, I think it was Marta and Brett. I think the issue here is not the language as such. I mean, we don't want everyone speaking, every language in the world. I think it's about openness and legitimacy, recognizing the research done. I don't know, in Mexico is as valuable as research done in a more dynamic, research dynamic country, simply that problems are different and context is different. I think it's more about that. And I'm bringing this up because I had personal experience here in the UK when I started my PhD. The problem that I wanted to explore didn't seem as important or relevant to people here in the UK because they had other ideas about what was happening in Mexico in regards to research. For them, it was everything about, oh no, Mexico doesn't do enough research, or they are just not good enough. And like, yeah, that's what you read in books and that's what you think, but that's not the full picture. That's not a complete picture, right? So I remember in that first 2 years of my PhD, I encountered this kind of, I'm going to say limitation, because I needed to push, in a sense, my agenda, and I needed to prove to them that looking at problems in other, let's say, less dynamic countries are also important. And for me, this is of huge significance because recently I submitted a research proposal to a call. I'm going to leave it just like that. And as I was asking for feedback from colleagues, because I was kind of posing a challenge on this center periphery notion when it comes to contributions. And I was framing this in terms of all these valuable contributions that Africa and Brazil have had on virology, and that I'm normally neglected because they don't have the resources or the infrastructure. And I remember that two colleagues said, yeah, we understand the problem. We just still believe that what we do is more important than what they are doing. So I think that as academics, that's the challenge, because every problem we explore in trying to understand how as a society we operate has value in itself. And another experience that, and I'm actually having this experience right now. I'm doing some research on REF. Those in the UK are quite familiar with REF. And I'm also quite familiar with SNI in Mexico. So I remember that I was telling them, not in the same kind of research problem or funding scheme. The similarities are there. The problem is not the same. But I was saying, something very similar happened in Mexico when they introduced the SNI. Sorry, I don't have the translation at this moment in my head. But it's a performance evaluation system. Okay, I was like, this has happened in Mexico because this, and that, and the games we're playing is this, and that, and some of the most negative effects are obviously visible in the wages for academics. But still, it doesn't resonate to them. Maybe I haven't yet managed to kind of tell them, hey guys, let's look at what's happening in other smaller countries that have been doing this for years, maybe at a smaller scale in terms of money, but this is happening somewhere else and it might, it might give you it might inform your decisions, or at least it might give you a different lens as to what research questions we need to pose when it comes to problems that happen in the core or the periphery. And Leonardo, Ola, I would really like to speak to you. I think we share some similar interests, and I really like to talk to you, and if possible to collaborate in the journal that you are leading at the moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now is the time for our guest to answer.
The question about resources is extremely difficult because I think the resources is not a problem at this very specific moment, but rather some kind of cultural attitude. I fully agree with Myra that sometimes it's enough to show that something exists. So, for example, resources might be needed to expand local infrastructures to show that research in Mexico, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Bangladesh is actually conducted. Because several times I discussed with researchers from North America or UK, and they often say that, oh, scholars of social sciences in Poland do not publish so much. But actually, researchers in Poland publish too much. Our research evaluation system pushes us to publish a significant amount of papers, and we publish a lot, but without showing this, and this might be the issue where resources is needed, some international infrastructures. But it is also not enough, because in Latin America there is regional infrastructure for showing this, but it must be legitimized. And I still think that saying that English is lingua franca for social sciences is some kind of distorted image of social sciences, because there are a lot of linguas francas. There is a Spanish, there is Arabic for Arabic words, where social scientists publish in this language, and there is also English, but French is also lingua franca for many disciplines. So I think that pushing scholars to learning, and I fully agree with Brett that spending a lot of time for learning a new language is something what makes that I, as a scholar, I'm not in a good position like my colleagues. So for example, now I spend a lot of hours every week to learn Spanish, because I hope 2 years I will be able to investigate Spanish Latin American evaluation systems, but it takes a lot of time. But when I discuss with other scholars who also use different languages, I see a common understanding. Then I'm pretty sure that talking and showing and pushing policymakers for acknowledging publications in other languages than English is the first step. It's not enough, I'm fully aware. It is a whole process. It will not take 5 years, but it should be put on the agenda of many organizations, and maybe the next generation of researchers will have a better word for publishing and communicating in various languages.
Yeah, I will start also answering that question. I see English. No, let's see. I will put it in a different way. Either lingua franca, any lingua franca, or multilingualism are sort of investment we have to do to communicate. And maybe we can have even other options, more efficient or not, more dependent on technology or not. But these are investments we have to do if we want to communicate. So I'm again using Tapuya as an example. Why to have a journal from Latin America in English? Well, because there are other journals in Latin America in Portuguese and in Spanish. So there is a niche there, but also there is a conviction that in order to get, in order to communicate with other parts of the world, but especially with other southern parts of the world, we should use English. And the fact that we will publish during this year a kind of special issue, which we call cluster, on technology and gender in Africa in a Latin American journal, is an example of the kind of circulation that we are interested in. So we are interested in circulation, or I am interested in circulation, and I would like Tapuya to continue to be a journal interested and framed within the kind of paradigm of circulation of knowledge. And English is one way to circulate, but it's not the only one. Because, for example, we will publish multilingual book reviews. So if you have a book in English, we publish a review in English, and maybe we have review in English and review in Spanish. And if you have the opportunity, we have a collective book reviews. So the person is reviewing, of course, he or she must be able to read in 2 or 3 different languages. But if he or she found, 2 or 3 books in English and Spanish connected around one topic, we want that collective review, and that collective review could be written in English or in Spanish or in Portuguese. So again, I think that we should think of these as tools, and I'm not considering them neutral tools. They are not neutral in terms of the geopolitics of language, especially in the academic world. They are not neutral, but they are tools, and they can be taken as tools sometimes, and for specific reasons. So I think the better situation is the one in which you think, write, and read in your mother tongue. All your skills are available in those cases. Otherwise, you are doing some sort of sacrifice, and that should be recognized. Should be recognized by reviewers, by readers, by editors, and by policymakers who decide the evaluation system. Should be recognized that you are doing big sacrifices to try to communicate in a language which is not your mother tongue. And that connects probably with the other part, which is resources. I have to say, I agree with Emanuel that sometimes it's not the big issue, but coming from a region in which resources are always a problem, I can't think of any policy, institutional policy, national policy, without a connection with the budget. So I think it's a very political economy approach, I would say, but it's my take on this. I have to have the resources to envision a change, for example, in the way that we want to include artificial intelligence. If I don't have a publisher as Routledge behind Tapuya, I don't have that tool to make an automatic translation, maybe a poor translation, but actually a translation. I can't pay for that as an independent journal. Even if an independent journal within the philosophy department and one important public university in Latin America, I can't pay. We are talking about thousands and thousands of dollars or pounds invested in artificial intelligence devices or platforms. So I think that we should think in terms of resources, but it doesn't condition what we are trying to do. And that's probably connected with the first question, Marta's question about the end. What's the final goal of that? And for me, the final goal is communication. So in order to communicate, you need infrastructure, you need guidelines, you need incentives, you need everything together, and that usually implies resources.
Okay, I think that this can be a good summary for the today's meeting. As we reach the time limit, I would like to once again deeply thank our guest for agreeing to join us for today's meeting and share his research, his ideas. I would like to also use this opportunity for brief announcements. First of all, this was a third seminar in our series, but in just 2 weeks, we will have a pleasure to host another meeting, this time with Dr. Kamil Łuczaj, who is present with us today. And we will discuss Poland as an academic periphery, insights from a qualitative study of foreign-born faculty. So please don't hesitate to join us and continue this conversation through the next seminars. Also, I would like to mention that we are currently preparing a newsletter with activities of our research groups. So if you would like to stay connected, stay informed about different activities that we try to organize, that it might be a good idea to leave your email so we can follow up and send you upcoming information about upcoming events. The link is in the chat, so also don't hesitate to do this. Once again, big thanks not only to our guest, but also for all of you. Thanks to the audience for engaging discussion. And I hope we will see each other in 2 weeks during our 4th seminar. Thank you.